Hi, and welcome to VFX Tutors. I'm Josh, and in this tutorial, we're going to go through how to track stock footage with no data. Just some random footage we found online with no idea what camera that's been used or any data, no lens grids or sensor size. We're going to try and figure all this out. I'm going to go through the entire shot. I'm going to go through tracking it, figuring out the lens distortion and the focal length. Then we're going to build some geometry in a 3DEqualizer with some techniques that I've used in other tutorials. Then we'll probably finish it off with modeling the building in Maya and completely finishing it off. We're going to go from first step to last step through the entire shot of this. So the first thing that we want to do is load in our image sequence. So I'm just going to go up to my sequence camera here. I'm going to go to live action footage and select browse. And then go to MM28, stock footage, and I've just got stock footage BG01. And I have no idea what this was shot on or what camera was used. It's a nice shot. It's not the most complicated, but we're going to be using the same techniques as you would with everything else. So first of all, we don't have to do our 8-bit color conversion because this is in JPEGs, so there's no color depth in this. This is just a flat image, so it'll be a lot lighter to download anyway, but yeah, there's no color data in here, so there'll be no dynamic range. So the first thing that we want to do is go to our playback and export our buffer compression file. And this might take a while, so I'll probably fast forward through this. Cool, so that's now exported, so we're going to import this in. And if we press spacebar, we can play for our shot. This is there's not a massive camera move on here. The last thing I really want, when we're doing shots like this, we want to really focus on getting our lensing correct. So I don't really want to don't want you to spend loads of time tracking shots when the most important thing about these shots is actually getting the lensing correct. So that's why some of these are a bit simpler. We'll add some harder ones, but I think at this point 2D tracking is not the thing that we really need to focus on. It's more of getting the correct lensing, which is the most important part. But we can do I'll put up some more difficult 2D tracking shots. So don't worry about that. If you want some really difficult ones, I'm sure I can make some for you. Cool, so usually we'd go through and fill out our lens and do our film back width and height. when you load in an image sequence, and if it's not, because I have no idea if this has been cropped or anything, it looks, at this resolution, it looks like it hasn't been cropped, especially not at 4K. So what happens with your film back width and height, it will come in at the correct aspect ratio. So we're not going to change this at all, because this film back width and height is correct for this plate. It's just not in the right sort of scale, if you know what I mean. Like, this ratio between these two is correct, but the values might be too high or too low. So we're actually going to leave this as this. And with a drone shot, we can probably safely assume that it's probably between, it could be anything lower than a 50mm probably. Then when you start getting bigger, it's bigger lenses, heavier, so I'm not sure if they're going to put that on the drones, but we can see this is a really wide shot anyway. So this is possibly a 25 or something like that. And you'll start to see that sort of stuff further on when you're working in shots and doing tracking. You'll just start to recognize focal lengths. So we're not actually going to change any of this, apart from changing our lens distortion model to a classic LD, because when we go to solving this distortion, we kind of want to keep it on the basic parameters. We don't want to be solving too much. So we're going to leave it on that. Then we're just going to start tracking. We're going to get a good spread of points. So I'm just going to turn my FOV off, and I'm just going to start picking points that are going to be useful for me. Size that up. I know some of the other tutorials that have come before this are probably a little bit more advanced with surveying, but I think I missed out doing something like this earlier on. I think it's been requested quite a lot to do something with no data and stock footage and stuff like that. So this is one of the top requested things, along with anamorphic and a couple of other things. So hopefully when I start getting through those, we can start leaving Matchmove behind and moving on to more VFX sort of things. Just going to go around and get as much on this church. There's a lot of useful tracking points on this church. Like I said, I picked this not to be a hassle with 2D tracking, more for your lensing and figuring out, because the process will be exactly the same. And it's quite a nice shot as well. Just going to stop that. I think I jumped up there. Oh, see. Always keep an eye on your tracks. It's jumping across, so that's probably because it's picking up the other bit. So let's actually include it in the pattern box. Cool. We can also track backwards as well. It tends to be my workflow: track forward, then track backwards, and just effectively seesaw backwards and forwards. Cool. So I'm going to try and get lots of, as many as I can on this foreground. We will go for a tracking technique that I haven't actually covered yet. Stopping and starting tracks, which is one of the most common things that you'll probably do, and I can't believe I actually haven't covered that yet. But I think it's probably because I went straight into production Matchmove and stuff like that. I didn't really start with a basics on Matchmove, but hopefully this should cover everything that you need to do if you haven't got any data or anything like that. Cool, so Got some good points there. Let's get some more on this church. Or whatever it is. I just assumed it was a church. No, it's got sort of a cross thing on it, so it probably is. So I'm just gonna gauge mark every so often so it refreshes the patch so it doesn't slip off. It starts to jump. See that? So I'm just gonna rotate it. Gauge marker and track. Oh, see, it's jumped across there. Stop that. Let's make it a little bit smaller. Gauge marker and track. Did I just? And let's do this one here. Well, so we got quite a lot on that church. Let's maybe get some stuff here. Because the more points we track, the easier it's gonna help us a lot with modelling stuff. But it's also gonna help us get a good lensing solve as well. It's slipping off there, so let's go back. Let's gauge marker and track. So I'm going to maybe do a couple more up here because this is going to help. Make sure you turn it off. So I think we've got quite a good few amount of tracks on that church now. So let's start pushing out to our sort of further out in our mid ground. You can pick your background if you like. I'm just slowly picking other bits. What's going to be useful to track? Shadow on the ground. Good. And obviously we're going to get a load of nice parallax in this. So, because obviously that runs out, I'm going to scrub back. Now I'm going to find something on a similar sort of depth. Here maybe. As it comes in, I'm going to track that. And that goes all the way through. So now I'm going to start tracking backwards. So pick this. There's plenty of stuff to track in there, so I shouldn't worry about that. If you're struggling to find things to track, there's absolutely loads. So okay, so this is going to be our first one where we sort of see it come out, but if we continue, it actually comes back in here. So we don't want to make another track there, we just want to continue this track. So if that's still selected, just left click, then use page up and page down to flick between the two keyframes. So that's page up and page down. And you want to use your nudge point to get it back in the same place. And once it's in the same place, you want to gauge marker and track. And doing shot tracks like this is going to really help your solve, because you've got tracks that are going in all the way from the beginning all the way to the end. But don't forget, every time you do that, you need overlapping tracks as well. So let's pick this, probably a top of a shed. It's probably very easy to track. So let's gauge marker and track. Make sure you stop it before it goes off. End point. Go through your timeline till it starts to come back in. We can see it there. Then just left click and use page up and page down to get it back in the right place. Then you want to make sure that your keyframes, you want to nudge them in so they come in the right place. So it's gauge marker and track again. You can see it's sort of slipping where it's going behind that tree. Probably don't worry too much, but it does slip quite a bit. So let's reduce this box. Gauge marker and track. It's slipping a bit, so we can just probably, let's just end that because it's causing more problems than we'd like going behind that. But what we can do, we can pick something that's a little easier to track. So if we actually look here, where did that go? I've actually got this shed roof here, which is quite good. And that goes all the way through. So gauge marker and track. There's nothing in front of it until, oh, stop that. Let's remove that key. Accidentally clicked. Gauge marker and track. And stop it before it slides off. An end point. Scrub through your timeline until it comes back. And there he is. Nice little shed. And just left click and use page up and page down to make sure you don't change this because you've just tracked this. You want to make sure you change the start frame. Never change the end frame. Always change the start frame. So I'm just using my nudge point on my number pad. I'm just going to gauge marker and track. So we've got quite a few things that we can track that go on and off. What's this here? Probably want to pick things that there's nothing, no trees going in front of it, and that's quite close to the ground. I'll just stop it before it goes on. End point. Oh, make sure you end it. Oh. Just clicked again by accident. End point. Then left click when it comes back in. And this is probably the most common technique that you will use. You'll use this all the time. And if you can get this right, you'll be able to do anything. Cool, so let's get some stuff over here. Even these tiny little patches are really good. You always need to make sure that you're overlaying tracks as well. So, because we've got a lot of good tracks coming on and off, we need to make sure that we've got tracks that are covering them for when they go off and on as well. So I'm just gonna pick some points. Just want to do what I always do and just try and get a really nice spread of points over the entire frame. Not like when we did the anamorphic shot where we predominantly tracked in the middle for the start. But that's different shot, different techniques. So if we select all our points, we can sort of see where we've tracked. We've got some good mid-ground stuff. Maybe even could do something here. Be surprised what this can track. Just end that. Not sure if that comes back in. I think it does. I think that is there. So I'm just using my end point, my page up and page down, and only ever change the start frame. Cool. Just going to gauge mark and track. So I'm going to start pushing out to our more background. So you've got tons of stuff to choose from to track here. before it goes off. And I'm just going to get these things here, probably little huts or something. It's likely that that might jump across to the other one because they're very similar. Just make sure you stop it before it comes off. I'm just going to go through and try and get as much of this as possible. So what I'm doing here is I'm always making sure I'm trying to keep an even space so it gives you a good overlap of points, because you don't want patches where there's no points suddenly coming off. So now we can start working back the other way. Just end that. And that does actually come back in, so what we can do is so because we've got start frame, we want to make this our end point. Scrub to here, do the same. So that's made our keyframes. Gauge mark and track. Come off a little bit, should be fine. Let's go back to this. So obviously it can be a bit difficult to find these patches, but you want to pick really recognizable parts, and you can sort of see it when you, even if you get randomly guessed, you can see where it is. If as long as you're in 2D, center 2D, you'll be able to figure out where you are. Some more bits here. And that before it gets there. Make sure you find the right place. Like say, I'm pretty sure I know where it is, but let's just say we randomly click there. We use our page up and page down. I mean, as long as you're on center 2D, you can sort of see where it is. So we're here. I'm just using my left mouse click to get it close then. My nudge tool, my number pad to nudge it in. So we definitely need some stuff over on this side. And that goes off. Couple points here. And see what happens when you don't end it, it sort of jumps off. So you need to make sure you end it. Otherwise it will just break your solve and give you hard times. And we've tracked quite a few points. So if we select all our points and just have a look, we can see that we've got a really good spread of points. Maybe not. Maybe we've not even got anything here. So let's add some stuff here. We may not need it, but just as a general rule of thumb, you want to make sure you've got an even spread. Don't be too biased to one side of the plate. We seem to be a bit right biased at the moment. So let's get some of these cars, sorry. I really want to hit some of this canopy stuff because it's not shifting as much. The pattern is staying quite the same all the way out. So let's try that. Let's press Alt-C to solve, and we can see we've got something. And if we look at our solve, we can see there's something pretty dreadful going on here. It's a mix of wrong focal length and no distortion. But in general, our track's working really well. It's not a difficult shot to track, but this, like I said, this is more trying to figure out the lensing for the shot, not necessarily to give you a hard time tracking. Because this is probably where most of you guys are probably going to be. You're going to be picking up stock footage if you don't use mine. Yeah. Like I say, unless you do your own footage and you have your own data. So the first thing that we want to do, once we've got a reasonable solve, let's first of all change our focal length to adjust. Then we can go to Windows, Parameter Adjustment window. I'm going to put this on wide, just to see where it sort of sits. I'm going to do it again. So both times on that, it's pushed it to a 40mm, which has reduced the deviation. And looking at, to be honest, looking at the quality of the footage, it does look quite good. So it doesn't look like a commercial sort of drone, or like a Mavic or something like that. This looks quite nice footage. So it's quite likely there's a good lens on it. So let's now go to our parameter adjustment and let's change this to fine, and let's clear that, change it to adaptive and select adjust. So it's really not changing that much. Cool. So it's kind of feeling that it's around a 40mm lens, and it seems reasonable. It doesn't seem too bad. We've not changed our film back width and height, so obviously if we did change that, our focal length would change. But for now, let's see what our distortion entails. So if we select our distortion, if we're getting really crazy distortion, it's probably a little bit wider than this, so then we can maybe adjust our film back width and height. So I'm going to select my distortion, go to my parameter adjustment, turn this off, clear that, and then go on adaptive and see what this gives us. So it's not changed much. So we'll do it a couple times, see if that helps. We can also change the brute force and see if that gives us a different result. This is a little bit lower. If we press Alt-C. So the difference between, you can use both. I tend to always find that adaptive works really well. But some shots are different. Sometimes brute force works better, sometimes adaptive works better. So don't just be like, oh, you have to use this. Try both. As long as you get reasonable results, not like insane distortion, it should be all fine. So now what we're going to do is go to our quartic, select adjust on that. And we'll do the same, put it on adaptive first to see how well that goes. Just do it a couple times, see if it changes. Also, make sure you save it, because once you've tracked a lot of stuff and you haven't saved it and it crashes, it's extremely frustrating. So make sure you save it. I'm just going to make a little folder here. Cool, so I saved it. So after doing this distortion, let's try it on brute force as well. Let's clear it. Now let's solve it. So it does seem to be getting a bit better. So we'll try our focal length. Adjust. So it's quite possible we need some more points. So what's a dead giveaway that we've kind of got a wrong focal length? As I've mentioned this before, is that this green line, so we're in at F5, this green line is our horizon, so it looks fairly reasonable, but this blue line also kind of indicates it's the farthest distance. So this blue line and this green line is like infinite distance. It's as far away. And if we go to F2, we can sort of see our clouds and stuff like this is in our infinite distance because it's really not moving. There's zero parallax here almost. So this blue line should almost be anchored on somewhere on the background. So this is telling me that we don't have enough data in the background, so we probably need to track something in the background. And we may need to put it as an infinite distant point so we can tell the solve that's as far back as it goes. So if we look at points, so let's pick a, let's see if we can actually track this cloud. It's barely visible. Let's change this to image controls. Let's reset, turn on. Let's see if we can pick up any information in this plate. There's very little dynamic range in this plate, so endpoint. So you probably could manually track through that if you wanted to. It does help a lot if you try and keep things solidly tracked, but I don't really want to keyframe a lot in this shot. Just want to pick up some of the issues that you'll have with tracking random footage. So these points are going to be sort of, these should track as our way distance in our infinite distance, basically. So see if there's anything else we can sort of pass over whilst that's coming off and on. Point here, gauge marker and track. Because we have no idea what's happened to this plate or who's done anything to it. It could, who knows? Who knows what's happened to it? Like when you convert your, so when you download a .mov or whatever video file off the internet, so it's always good to check what frames per second it's been shot at. Luckily they've shot this at 24, but sometimes you might get 25, sometimes you might get 30. So whenever you export render out your image sequence, you need to make sure that you get the correct frames per second. Or you might get some weird things happening in your plate. Or you can sort of convert them all to 24 frames per second. Cool, so we've got that. Let's gauge, mark, and track. It's a bit bumpy. Yeah, let's solve that, see what happens. And if we select these and change these to infinitely distant, so that's in the far background. See if that's actually. And now let's press Alt-C and solve. And now you can see that these points have been jetted off to the far background. And now you can see our points are sort of sticking. So let's go to our image control window, turn that off. Go to our parameter adjustment, and let's do another wide focal length adjustment. Let's see where that gives us. See, now it's gone down to 35. Solve that. Fine. Just. So now we've got this in an infinitely distant. It's giving us some more reasonable results. But we still got this problem here. So what we can do is change these both to adaptive and solve both of these at the same time, see if that helps. So they'll kind of work together. You might get some odd results, but so just keep going through. Let's try and brute force. Bring up our samples. This might take a little bit longer, but like I say, we'll get different results. It's possible we just need to track more points. It's going to take quite a while, so I'll just cancel that. So I'm just going to actually track some more points. On the way back here, because we've not got anything back there. Solve that. Let's go back to our. So what we can do, let's try. Let's brute force all. Let's possibly give us some very odd results, but it might work. So we're kind of getting everything to sort of relax with the distortion and the focal length. So it's probably will take a lot longer. If it takes ages and ages, I might fast forward through this. Or in fact, let's just stop that. And let's just do focal length and distortion. So that's helping it quite a lot. And we can probably do the quartic afterwards. Solve that. See our deviation's getting better now. Still got some strange stuff going on, so let's now turn our distortion and turn our quartic on. See how we get different results from adaptive and quartic, adaptive and brute force. But we need to keep an eye out for abnormalities in our distortion, because they could cause more problems in the long run. But just loosening this up with the distortion, getting the focal length to work with the distortion on a solve, it seems to be helping it quite a bit. We're starting to get lower. Just because it's low as well doesn't mean that it's going to turn out to be a good solve. It can be at 0 or 0.01 and still be a bad solve. So just be aware of that. Shouldn't really solve these together, but when nothing's working, sometimes you have to sort of let it relax around the focal length and distortion. It's only because sometimes you see some really bad distortion that some people have made, and it causes more problems than not distorting it, because you can add ripples to the plate because don't forget, this distortion's got to be placed on the CG to match the plate. So if you've got really weird distortion that looks like it's working, when they're not going to add that distortion to the image sequence, they're going to be adding that distortion to the CG footage. So if your distortion's got weird ripples and stuff in it, it's going to ripple the CG. Then it's going to look really odd over the plate. It's just not going to match. That's really important to make sure that your distortion is logical. So this is taking quite a lot of time, so I'm just going to stop that. And let's just see what it's doing before we go any further. So let's press F5. The distortion looks normal for a wide shot, so that's not bad. So what I'll do, I'm actually going to save that. So it's looking to eat my hat and say it's actually looking pretty good when I thought it might not. So it might be struggling doing it that way, so let's just do the quartic by itself, because it seems to be sticking around a 27mm lens. So we can go back to here and maybe do our distortion again. Do them separately, see if that helps. So I'm using a lot of the brute force because it seems to be working a bit better than the adaptive so far. So these points in the background are looking really good. Let's see what's causing us. Could be slipping points that are causing us problems. It looks more like if we change that to 3D. So yeah, let's see what happens if we switch this back to adaptive, select adjust, see if it does an adaptive solve from the brute force solve. Seems to be working. So don't just be stuck with you have to use one. Switch between the two and see what gives you the better results. Like obviously if one's going completely nuts, try to avoid using it even more. But we're just going to slowly chip away by adjusting this. Focal length. See, it's only going down tiny bits. We're only changing it small bits, so we can do it again and see how that goes. So for a 26mm, or probably a 25, or it's not looking too bad. So let's try adding both of these together. This is where, let's save it first. Just save it with that one. So if you do too much of this, it can start to go a bit funny. I feel like we can get quite a good solve from this. Distortion's looking good. We've got no pin cushioning effect, which makes the sort of the rippling in the top, which is what we need to avoid. And let's try both these together on adaptive. And it's probably going to get to a certain point where our lensing is working quite well. It's probably our 2D points. Maybe that's a bad 2D track, but at 0.6, that's a pretty good solve for just random footage that you don't know. What we can do, let's change it to brute force one more time and try that. See if it gives us a different result. In fact, actually, let's stop that and cancel that because on 200 samples. Let's leave it on adaptive. You know, I'm fairly happy with that. That's a, well, we'll see what it's doing first before we decide if it's good or not. So we center 3D on that point. At this point, when you've got a solve, center 3D is the one that you want to use to check your points because it's where it's going to be in 3D space. So we'll pick these church ones. And they all look really good. Even in our infinite distance ones. We full frame this, press spacebar and play. It's looking like a pretty solid track. So save it. I guess what we can do is just add a couple extra more tracks on it to help maybe with our modeling of it. In fact, we can, yeah, no, let's see what happens if we add a couple extra tracks. Shouldn't make any difference to the solve. So it's working really well. Solve that. It's actually got lower with more tracking points, so there's proof that more tracking points do help us solve. So I'm quite happy with that. If we go to F5, we can see that we've got our points here, and everything's looking really good. We've successfully tracked the first part of this shot. So what we can do now is let's save it. And what I'm going to do now is, because I don't really want to model all of this environment, I want to try and get a point cloud. So I'm going to go to F4. And I'm going to go to my first keyframe. And I'm going to use the auto track to build the geometry in the background. So first of all, I'm going to select add mask. And I'm just going to, if you hold Control left click, it adds a vertice to the mask. So what I'm going to do is just going to crudely rotate out this church. And you can do it really nice if you want. I don't really like roto or anything like that, so I'm going to do it quite rough. Cool. So we've rotated that out. Perfect. Perfect roto. It's going to win many awards. I'm just going to Control Shift to select all of them. Then bring this down. Ooh. Just going to keep all of it covered because I don't want it being in the auto track. Check it. Once it's good, Control Shift. I'm going to select them all and Control. Oh, why is it? Make sure you select the actual vertex. Ooh, so zoomed out. Right. I'm just going to adjust these to cover up the sort of church. Cool. And that's that pretty much masked out. So I'm going to go over to my camera settings and I'm going to go to auto tracking. So I want to auto track a lot because I want a lot of this. In fact, actually, I also need to do one more mask, sorry. So I'm going to go back to the first frame, add a mask, and I'm going to mask out the sky because we don't want to track the sky at all. Most of this background stuff doesn't particularly matter. Cool, so let's just adjust these vertices to sort of cover up the sky. So we're just going to roughly rotate this out. Like I say, it doesn't have to be amazing. Just enough to stop the background getting caught up in the solve. Cool. So what I'm just going to save this. And now I'm going to go to my auto tracking settings. And I'm going to change this to 2000 to, in fact, I'm going to change it, I'm going to change it to 2000 to 3500. And I'm going to leave these. I'm going to change my search area size. I'm going to half them to 4 and 6. I'm going to half this as well to 1.5 to 2.5. And I'm going to change my minimum distance to 1. And I'm going to select auto, so it should be an F4 menu. I'm going to select track. And this is going to spray everything on the environment with tracks. And this is going to help us build the environment behind us because we can model this church easy in Maya. So this is probably going to take a really long time, so I'm probably going to fast forward through this. Cool, so that's done now. So as we can see, it's absolutely sprayed our environment with points. And you don't really want to manually track all that, so this is the only time that I'd use auto tracking in a solve. I'd probably never use it to actually create a camera track. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select all my, you'll know which ones are the autos because I say A at the start. I'm going to select all my tracked points. I'm going to right click, add new point set, and it call these solve. So I know that my points in here are the ones that I've got my really good camera solve with. I'm going to add new auto, so I know which ones are the auto tracks. So unfortunately it goes all the way to the bottom, so we'll do the auto tracks first. So select the first auto track, scrub all the way down to the bottom, select the last one, middle mouse click and drag them under auto. See, we've got 16,000 points there, so it's quite a lot. So now we'll select our solve tracks and put them under our solve. We'll make sure we select all of them. Cool. So now we've got our solve tracks and our auto tracks. So let's save this because we don't want to do that again, because that probably might take quite a while, depending on how powerful your computer is. So let's save that. And let's select our solve points and view, hide them, because we want to hide them because we're going to end up probably deleting some of these and we don't want to delete them by accident. So the first thing that we want to do is select all these points. Don't solve it yet. Select all the points, go right click, modify, calculation, and make sure you select passive. You want these on passive. You don't want them to solve. You just want them to be placed in the correct depth. And that's basically what that does. It means that they'll sort of work with the solve, but they won't affect the solve at all. They'll just be placed in the depth. So what we can also do, we can go to calc, and we can go find badly tracked points, and it will filter through all the points, frames, to find any really sort of dodgy points, and it's usually really good, so it will find any sort of slipping points. And it's not found any, so most of these shots are going to be pretty good anyway. So with it all on passive, so before you solve, make sure that they're on passive, because you don't want to solve this when these are not on passive, otherwise it will take a really long time and probably crash your computer, or it will break your complete solve. So I'm just going to go to F2, and we can see all the points that it's made. I can see, I thought there was one on. And now it's on passive. We're solving 9,000 points. So press Alt-C. And this might take a little bit longer than usual. But, so it's figuring out the camera position from our solve points. And now it's figuring out the position of our 2D tracked points, which we've tracked. And this is going to just help us get a really nice sort of geometry for the area. Instead of modeling all this, we can quickly make a rough scan, and some of it's worked pretty well. We'll have to delete some of these points, but we can already see here that we've got a really good result. We've got some floating points, but that doesn't matter because this has just saved us a lot of time. So I'll select use result. Then I'm going to go to F6, and if you left click you can look around. So we've got loads of points behind our camera. So the first thing that we want to do is hold Alt and left click. Delete all the points that are behind our camera. Because they're just useless. They're just misplaced points. Just going to go through and delete them. And when you look around at this point cloud, you can see the general shape of the environment. And then you can also see some points that have slipped through. It's probably all down to my bad roto on the mask. So what we can do, find yourself a position where you can sort of delete stuff. I'm just going to go through and delete all these flat ones. Anything that looks a bit odd. You can see that if I go view and turn off my image plane, you can sort of see the points that are in the wrong place easier. So we've got quite a few that are sort of floating. So this is why we hide our solve points, because our solve points would still be in here. Although they're in the, they won't be floating like this. Still, it's not worth risking deleting them by accident. So I'm just going to go through. I'm just going to shift across, delete all these floating ones. Just going to try and retain the shape of the hills. This is how you get really accurate set geo for your environments. If it's an organic environment, you probably wouldn't use this on buildings as such. That's why I masked out the building. But for like big landscapes, this is perfect for it. But I didn't use it to create my camera solve because, as you can see here, there's a lot of bad points, and if you tracked with those, you'd have to fix them, and fixing points in a solve could probably take a little bit longer than actually tracking it normally. So personally, I would always avoid trying to do cameras in auto tracking because yeah, it's just bad. You'll end up spending more time fixing it, basically. And half of the battle with Matchmove is the 2D tracking. If your 2D tracking is good, that means you can rely on it. And as soon as you're in that position, mostly it's just problem solving with lenses. And once you're in that point, it becomes a lot easier. That's why, as a rule of thumb, just never use auto tracking. It's just not good. Unless it's just something that's ridiculously stupidly easy and it's like fail proof, maybe. But even when you're at that point, you may as well just track it manually anyway. It will save you a lot of headaches. So it's getting harder to see the floating points, but I'm just sort of keeping this general mass of points fairly logical. I'll have to zoom in and come down. See some more floating ones. So I'm just going to come close to the point cloud. Just try and delete them. So it's going to get increasingly more difficult to find them the more and more you delete, because it's just a lot of green and green. So you go to F5 and it's probably quite hard to see because we've got so many points. Let's try and remove a lot of these floating ones. These floating ones could just be don't know what they could be, but it's probably unlikely they're actually trees. Let's just... And it's never going to be like a full scan, so don't worry if you delete too many points. We just want a good set geo. If you scrub around, you can see a lot of the floating points. It's just trying to grab them without deleting too much. We can always fix that afterwards, but this is just to get us the general landscape, so we don't have to really model it, because that can be a bit of a pain. Whereas this way, a lot of our work's already done for us. We know it's going to work with the camera. And we've got all these sort of lumps and hills. So there is a lot in the middle, you can't quite see it. If I just select all those, rotate down. It's very hard to see which points are what. To be honest, I'm very unsure about these ones at the background anyway, so it's probably mostly those. I'm not too bothered about not having those, but I think those are probably, because any points back here, we're going to kind of lose our parallax anyway, because it's so far away. So if we just delete all these points here, hopefully this should remove a lot of our problem points. Because we're probably not going to want that. So back then we can quite easily make some basic geo, but let's just imagine that our premise is mostly in this foreground. Let's just delete all these points behind this sort of ridge. So I think that's probably what's going to cause us the bigger problems. And if we... because there's just no parallax really beyond that point. And the idea of this is to make our lives a little bit easier and not have to model loads of geometry. So go to F6 and have a look around. We've still got some floating points. Reduced it quite a bit though. But we can see a lot easier. So I'm just lining up, trying to remove all this sort of wasted points. And it doesn't matter if you delete too much, because this is kind of doing us a favor anyway. It feels like we're probably deleting some buildings, which is fine because probably don't want that stuff in there anyway. Float one here. I'm just going to keep scanning around at a relatively low height. Still got loads here. So it makes it easier, but Sometimes it doesn't, but we've already got a huge environment here, so it's just patience, really. There's quite a lot in this area, so let's just delete all of them. They've just deleted a big patch out of the ground. Okay, so let's try this. There's a lot of points back here. I don't think any of these are going to do us really any good, so let's get rid of those because we want to build a pretty clean mesh. Let's see where those are. So I feel like a lot of those points are actually shrouded in this sort of layer. So I feel like the further we get back, the worse our geo is. So if we go to F6, let's get rid of that chunk there. So it looks pretty good for a rough set geo. We've definitely got a couple big. We'll have a couple big spikes in there, but let's just try it. So if we go to F6, let's select all our points. Let's go 3D models, create, mesh run points, and legacy. Let's create mesh. See what this looks like. So if we go view, hide selected points. So what we've got here is some clipping. Let's change our clipping plane. And obviously we've got some really odd stuff here, but there's nothing that we can't smooth out in Maya. So let's select our point group. Our mesh. Let's bring this down so we can see it easier. Full frame that, and we can sort of see what we've done. And you've got these points here, these are just points that we've missed, and this is very easily smoothed out in Maya. But what we have here is geometry that works extremely well with an environment. So we didn't have to model any of this, all we have to do is just do a quick cleanup on it, and we should be good to go. Then all we have to do now is model the building. So even though that looks kind of rough, we're pretty much done now in 3D. Our next step is probably to save this. And now what we want to do, we want to export out our camera. So I'm going to go 3D, export project, Maya. I'm going to change my start frame to 1001 because that's when my image sequence starts. So let's go to our stock footage one. We'll call this stock footage BG01 V01 cam version 1. Okay, and make sure you have no 3D. You don't want to export it, you just want the camera. In fact, actually, let's cancel that. We've saved that. And in fact, yeah, let's carry on because this is going to export out these points as well. So we've saved it. So what we can do, so we don't have to export because we don't really need these points, and we don't want them to come in with our camera. As long as you save it, make sure you save it first. Then what we can do, you can just delete all those points. Then we go 3D export project Maya sequence camera, sorry, I shouldn't have changed that. I can't remember what that was on. All cameras, let's just leave it all cameras. I'll start frame 1001. Let's go to our tutorial, we'll call it stock footage PG01 cam V01. So now that's going to export with just our solve point cloud, so it's going to be a lot easier to load into Maya. Cool. So now what we want to do is export our point mesh. So we have to go to F6. And we can see here it's quite rough, but we'll smooth that out, that's fine. We've managed to save a lot of time doing it this way. And we'll go to 3D models, export 3D model as OBJ, and we'll just call it stock footage stop it. PC mesh for point cloud mesh, and export that. So now we need to export out our Nuke LD node for our distortion. So we'll go File, we'll export LD 3D4 lens distortion node. And we'll do the same again. Nuke LD node V01. Select OK. So now our final thing that we need to do is export out our undistorted plate. And you can do this multiple ways. You can do this in Nuke with the LD node. For the sake of staying in one, we're not really going to be using it other than just using it for reference. I'm just going to render it out from Warp 4. So I'm going to go 3D4, run Warp 4, and this window should open. And all we need to do is go down to destination footage, save footage, select browse. Let's go to our shot, call it new directory, and we'll call it UDP for undistorted plate. We'll call it the same name, stock footage BG01 V01 UDP for undistorted plate dot 4 hashes. So now it's image sequence dot JPG. You need to make sure it's the same in Warp 4. You need to make sure it's the same image file. So click OK. Then we won't do overscan. We don't do overscans anymore. That's always done in the renderer now. So doing overscans is just it's not good because it also changes your original camera. So making overscans is quite old-fashioned. We just do it all in the renderer now. So don't worry about that. Let's select render, and you should start getting green keys come up now. And this may take a while, so I'll probably fast forward through this. Cool, so that's done now, so we can close that. And we're pretty much done in 3D. We've done everything that we needed to do. We've tracked our camera, we've got our rough environment geometry, and now all that we need to do is model this in Maya because it'll just be a lot easier. Cool, so if you've enjoyed that tutorial, hit that like button and subscribe for more like this.